Hello Geeks and Ghouls, and happy October, also known as Halloween month. So to celebrate this holiday, the spooky holiday, we have this special 31 short stories to Halloween, one per day, and we'll start with Howard Phillips Lovecraft's The Mound. Basically, it's Howard Phillips Lovecraft and Zelia Bishop, and I've read it in this book over here, The Horror in the Museum by Wordsworth Editions. The budgets, short story, classic horror books. It's also available in the hardback tome of Eldritch Tales, which contains a lot of the co-written stories, the Lovecraft collaborations. I guess the whole me reading The Mound, one of the more obscure and kind of large Lovecraft stories, is a weird choice, and I could easily get to some of the more famous ones, like the video I did about The Color Out of Space, or my top 5 Lovecraft stories. I could do something similar with a well-known story and actually try to get more clicks. So thank you for trusting me and clicking on me talking about this obscure story, but I've got a reason for this. This story, The Mound, is actually the very first horror story I've read. I've read it 20 years ago. I've read it on July or August 2001, and we'll go back into the past. As I was growing up, science fiction, fantasy, and horror fiction were not that welcome in bookstores, especially in small town bookstores. So I've heard of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. I think I was reading a lot of PC Games magazines, and there were mentions of him and his work, so I was like, this sounds interesting. I want to read his stuff. Played some interactive fiction games based on his work, and I was like, yes, I want to read more of him. So the summer of 2001, I was in Sparta, and I went through all the bookstores I could find asking for Lovecraft books, and I didn't find any. I think the only horror book I did find was a copy of Necroscope 2 Vampiri, which I bought years later, but that's another story at all, and I was very dejected by it. I was like, why isn't this Lovecraft guy anywhere? Finally, I went to a press kiosk looking up for magazines that may interest me because I wanted to read something, and I stumbled upon this book, which it's all Greek to you, but it's pocket collection. While bookstores didn't have science fiction and fantasy books, there were a lot of pocket books that were sold in press kiosks, and they had short stories, horror short stories and fantasy short stories. If you've seen my summer book haul video, I showed some of the fantasy ones, the sci-fi ones. This was a horror one. This was a different series, and it contained 4 collaborations by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, as well as 3 stories by August Derleth. I got this book, I went home, I read it, and I freaked out. This story, The Mound, made me love horror fiction and Howard Phillips Lovecraft. It got me, and I just had to read everything I could get my hands on, and even though I've bought this book quite a few years ago, I have still to read it, so I've got some Lovecraft stories I have yet to read. But enough of me blathering about how I started reading horror, and let me get into the story The Mound, which I reread for this series of videos. Alright, a little bit of warning. I'm going to give a synopsis of the story, and it's going to be chock full of spoilers, so if you plan to read the story, go read it and return to this video afterwards, alright? Most of those stories are very old and you can find them easily. So what's The Mound about? It's about a mound, an artificial hill in Oklahoma, which is reputed to be haunted. At daylight, people see an Indian man, but a strange Indian man. They're not sure what his tribe is. During the night, there is a headless girl with a blue torch. So there are a lot of legends about it, and archaeologists go to the nearby town to see what the deal's about. And as he gets there, he hears stories of people who try to go to that mound, and they either never returned or they returned mad and seriously altered. One man who went there returned and he was a bubbling idiot. He crawled into this town and he spent 8 years screaming about things he saw. Another man, an old man, went there and he returned young with his feet amputated and mysteriously healed. And then there was another man, World War I veteran, who went with his brother, only he returned and he killed himself. And when the forensics examined him, his internal organs had been reversed. So this archaeologist is very perplexed by the stories. He visits the nearby Indian tribe, and there is this elderly chief of the tribe who tells him that something evil lies down there and he shouldn't go, but he gives him a pendant for protection, a pendant that is from a weird metal, and it's got an octopus and a snake, I believe, engraved on it. And this is Yig, and the octopus is, I don't know what octopus is, you know what octopus is in a Lovecraft story, right? So he goes to the hill, and there he feels that this medallion is attracted by something buried. So he unearths a case with a manuscript inside that is written in Spanish, and this casing is also made of the metal that the medallion is made of, and it has octopi and serpents on it. And so he takes the manuscript and reads it, and it's the story of a Spanish man, a conquistador, one of the men. Zamacona is his name. He's one of Cortés' men. They were on the lookout for the fabled golden cities of the New World, and as they go from failure to failure, one of the natives tells Zamacona of a fabled he knows where the golden city is. It's deep underground, and there is a secret passage there, because the people down there need to breathe. So he shows him the way, and Zamacona goes in there. He sees some startling images, and there is, by this point, the story is really interesting. There is a sense of mystery, of escalation, as he is seeing the sights he's seeing. There's a lot of foreshadowing of the horrors down there. It's a very Lovecraftian story, despite being a collaboration with another author, and I'll go about the story of who Zelia Bishop is in a while. So yes, he finally is captured by the natives of this underworld city that's indeed made of gold, and these people are not exactly human. They're a sort of different type of Native American, and they're a very advanced race. They are the descendants of those who came first, the people that the god Tulu, sounds familiar, right, brought to earth, and they have a lot of inscriptions of him, as well as the serpent god Yig. And Yig was co-created with Zelia Bishop, and so their city is it's running on ancient technology, and they're a very decadent race. They have the power to become incorporeal. They are immortal. They die and return to life, and they can also resurrect other dead beings. So they have mounts that are some unicorns, human-like unicorns. They're quadrupedal humans that have one horn in their head, and they are carnivorous, and they have a caste of slaves. They grow, and since they're decadent, they have fun with them. They have them fight, or they execute them, and then they resurrect them, even though they are disfigured, and have them work in the farms or anywhere in the city. So, and they're also telepathic, because they're superhuman. So, in other words, we have this utopia, this advanced secret city, like in Plato's Utopia or something, only it's a darker reflection of it. Everything is reversed, people are bored, and they commit atrocities just to feel something. And Zamacona he's their guest, and he's supposed to give them information about his world, and also he's forbidden to live because he will tell everybody that they live inside the earth. So he stays with them for 4 years. He's growing horrified by their actions, so he seduces one of the locals and they attempt to escape from a hidden passage, but they're captured. Zamakona is like, he's reprimanded that don't do this again. You're precious to us because of the information you have on the world above, but don't do this again because you'll be punished. And the woman is decapitated and reanimated as a guard for the mound, because now they have to set guards there to make sure nobody comes from that passage or nobody lives. Zamakona still writes and says at the end of his manuscript that I should try to escape again. And this is where the manuscript ends, and he will only take this manuscript with him because apparently he learned to dematerialize himself so he can pass through walls and escape. Our nameless protagonist is, of course, he doesn't believe that the manuscript exists, so he goes to the hill the other day and tries to dig up, to continue the research, and his tools that he left on the hill have disappeared. He thinks somebody's pulling a prank, so he digs, and finally the ground breaks and he goes into a cavern, and as he's walking in the cavern he feels wind clawing at him and shapes all around him. He glimpses shapes, so he is a bit freaked out, but at some point he discovers that in this tunnel down there is a flashlight which is smoldering despite this place being buried for ages. And then he finds his own tools down there which have no place because the ground was unbroken when he dug up the mound. And finally he sees what remained of Zamakona, whatever the guy's name is, and it's a parody of a human being. He was cut to pieces and reanimated. So he just goes mad and runs outside and leaves this Oklahoma town forever. So yes, it's very typical Lovecraft story. First time I've read it, I was a horror virgin, of course. I was impressed by it, I was horrified, I felt chills and shivers up my spine. So I guess it was a good thing that I read it back then, because now that I'm more used to horror stories and I read the story knowing what's happening, I was not impressed. I think it's a very typical Lovecraftian story. It's a bit long, but you know what, it's not over long, and actually was never published back then because it was too long for publication. And I think that was the reason why Zelia Bishop and Hartford Lovecraft stopped working together. They collaborated for 3 stories. The Great Yig, I think it was the first one. The Curse of Yig was the first one. Then they did The Mound, and finally they did Medusa's Coil. Medusa's Coil was a great story. On my first time reading it, I'm not sure how I will feel about reading it, but the first time I just threw the book away at the end. So yes, it's a good thing I've read back then because I could appreciate it more. Nowadays, knowing what was happening in that story and having read a lot of Lovecraft, it's not one of his best stories. It's a good story though, and I really liked it. So yeah, if you skip the spoilers for the story and you want my opinion of it, read it. It's quite good. So what's the deal with Zelia Bishop? Zelia Bishop was a widow who was an Oklahoma native, and she wanted to be an author to make money. I know it's funny. So she found Lovecraft and they were collaborating. She was paying him for basically rewriting her stories or writing her stories based on her ideas. She had a lot of folks, knew a lot of lore on Native Americans, and she set the tone for it. But the way Lovecraft is introducing a lot of Cthulhu mythos in this story means that he either did some very heavy writing or that he wrote the story himself. Of course, Lovecraft was an uncommercial author in his life, believe it or not, so he didn't care about making money, he cared about the art. So yeah, Zelia Bishop cared about making money, so it didn't work out. I mean, there are even mentions of the Clark Castle Smith Hyperborean, AIDS, and Sathogwa and his people So yeah, it's Cthulhu mythos. It's a good Cthulhu mythos story. And if you plan to read everything Cthulhu by Lovecraft, yes, you should read this one. It's not just some mentions of the great old ones and Cthulhu. No. It's definitely a Cthulhu mythos story and the whole cosmos that Lovecraft was setting up. So yeah, it's a good read. You can enjoy it if you like Lovecraft. If you don't like Lovecraft, it's not the story, it's not a must-read story. But then again, it made me love horror. So yeah, it has a very specific place in my heart. And now that I've read it and I was not that impressed, I'm a bit more leery of reading this book because, yeah, I mean, other stories I liked may be bummer. So yeah, if you read The Mound by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, leave a comment below, like, subscribe. There will be another story featured tomorrow. Have fun, stay spooky.